Something may be developing behind the scenes in Baltimore that could completely change how fans are looking at this roster right now. At first, it sounds like a simple question. Does this team need another wide receiver? But the deeper you go into it, the more intriguing it becomes. Because this isn't just about adding another name to the roster. There may be a bigger question hiding underneath all of it. What if the Ravens are waiting for something, or someone, already inside the building to prove they are the answer? And if that's true, then what happens if a surprise starts emerging during these off-season workouts? Could the entire conversation shift overnight? Stay with me because what I'm about to discuss might completely change the way you see Baltimore's plans moving forward. But before we continue, make sure you've already smashed that like button if you truly believe this team has something special ahead. And I want to see the optimism in the comments today. Right, I believe the Ravens' best is still coming. Now let's get straight into this because things just got very interesting. When people hear somebody say a team is thin at a position, the immediate reaction is usually that the team doesn't have enough players. But according to the information being discussed here, that may not really be the issue. The conversation isn't necessarily about numbers. It's about something else entirely. Right now, the receiver group being discussed includes Z Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Devontae Walker, Jacoby Lane, Elijah Sarrett, and LaJohntay Wester. That's a collection of young names that gives Baltimore bodies at the position. So on paper, it doesn't immediately scream shortage. And that's where things begin getting more interesting. Because the discussion shifts from quantity to experience. The idea being raised is not that Baltimore lacks receivers physically on the roster. Instead, the concern could be whether the team has enough proven experience in that room. That's a very different conversation. Then more details start coming out. The report mentions that Baltimore addressed the receiver position in the draft, but not during the first 2 rounds. Jacoby Lane from USC and Elijah Sarrett from Indiana were added in rounds 3 and 4. And that creates another question. Did Baltimore simply add players to the room, or did they add immediate impact players? Those are 2 very different things. Because young talent can absolutely develop, but when you're evaluating a roster during OTAs and minicamps, coaches are trying to answer bigger questions. They're trying to determine whether those players are ready right now. Can they immediately fit into the system? Can they contribute at the level the team wants? Can they be trusted when opportunities come? The report also points toward OTAs and minicamps being extremely important evaluation periods because these sessions give teams opportunities to study what they currently have before making any outside moves. And that may be where the real story is hiding. Because nobody is saying Baltimore has already decided they need a veteran. Nobody is saying a move is guaranteed. The idea being discussed is patience. Watch the players already on the roster. See how they look. See how they fit. See who stands out. See who surprises people. Then make a decision. And if Baltimore reaches a point where they feel something is missing, the possibility exists that free agency could still become an option later. What's fascinating is that names such as Keenan Allen, Stephon Diggs, and Tyreek Hill were mentioned as examples of veteran options still out there in the discussion. Now, that does not mean Baltimore is pursuing anyone. That does not mean talks are happening. That does not mean a signing is coming. But the fact that those names are even being connected to the conversation shows that people are wondering whether experience eventually becomes a priority. And if Baltimore decides to wait, there may not be pressure to rush anything either. The discussion specifically suggests there is still time, and options could remain available later depending on how the current players develop. So now the conversation turns directly to the fans because this is where opinions are probably going to split right down the middle. Some people may look at this receiver room and say, trust the young players, let them develop, and stay exactly where you are. Others may look at experience and say, bring in somebody proven if the opportunity makes sense. And that's where I want to stop for part 1 because this question could divide Ravens fans more than people expect. What makes this entire discussion even more interesting is that the approach being described feels like a waiting game rather than a situation where urgency exists. Right now, according to the material, the focus appears to be on evaluation. Watch what happens during OTAs. Watch what happens during minicamps. Give the younger receivers opportunities to show what they can do before making any major decision. And when you think about it from that angle, it starts making more sense. Because if you immediately rush into bringing in a veteran, then you're automatically reducing opportunities for the players already competing for those spots. But if you wait, now you can actually gather information instead of guessing. You can see who creates separation. You can see who catches consistently. You can see who adjusts quickly. You can see who understands assignments. You can see who starts standing out naturally. That's a completely different process than making decisions based only on what players might do. Instead, You're seeing what they actually do. And that's probably why this conversation doesn't feel like panic at all. It feels like observation. Because the report specifically points toward Baltimore potentially wanting more information before considering anything externally. Now, another thing that stands out is that the discussion repeatedly circles back to experience versus youth. Because again, the issue isn't necessarily numbers. The room itself already has players in it. The question becomes, who emerges? And that's where things get difficult because younger players can sometimes surprise everyone. Sometimes a player enters camp and immediately starts making noise. Sometimes players develop faster than expected. Sometimes they show chemistry and timing that nobody predicted. Sometimes somebody completely changes the outlook of an entire position group. And if that happens here, then suddenly the entire conversation about adding a veteran starts disappearing. Because if the coaching staff sees enough from the current group, then why make another move? That's what makes the next several weeks feel important. Because these evaluations could quietly determine the direction Baltimore chooses. The report also brings up another point that shouldn't be ignored. There doesn't appear to be immediate pressure because available options aren't disappearing all at once. The discussion suggests there may still be time if Baltimore eventually wants to move in that direction. So imagine how interesting this becomes over the next stretch. Suppose younger receivers start flashing. Suppose somebody unexpectedly rises. Suppose coaches begin feeling comfortable with what they're seeing. Then suddenly the narrative changes from Baltimore may need help to Baltimore already found help internally. And that's why this entire thing feels less like a roster emergency and more like a story that's still unfolding. Right now there isn't a final answer. There isn't a completed picture. There isn't a move that's happened. There's only evaluation, possibilities, and patience. And honestly, that may be why this discussion has become so interesting among Ravens fans in the first place. Because everybody watching this situation probably has a different answer in their head already. Some fans are probably saying trust the young players completely. Some fans are probably saying bring in experience immediately. Others may be somewhere right in the middle, wanting to see how camp develops before choosing a side. But now I want to hear from you. Another layer of this story starts appearing when you look at the overall feeling surrounding the discussion. Because one thing that kept showing up throughout the material is that nobody involved sounded like they believed Baltimore was operating from a position of desperation. And that's important. Desperation creates rushed decisions. Desperation creates panic moves. Desperation usually creates situations where teams feel forced into doing something immediately. But this doesn't sound like that at all. This feels more like a team saying, let's gather information first. Because think about what was being said regarding these off-season sessions. Coaches are getting opportunities to see players up close. They're watching movement. They're watching execution. They're watching whether players fit what they want to accomplish. And sometimes that's where surprises happen. Every offseason there are players that enter the process without huge expectations attached to them, and then suddenly people start paying attention. Maybe somebody starts making difficult catches. Maybe somebody begins showing consistency. Maybe somebody starts understanding the system quicker than expected. Maybe somebody